was it like? You know, you're in your digs, you're there lying in bed, you're doing whatever, and you get the knock on the door. Clock or 10 o'clock. This is like 2 o'clock in the morning. We just played a night game. I was in bed, and so like, I want to see it at 9 o'clock in the morning. Someone else was coming back from suspension or injury, and no matter how well I'd played, I'd still get left out.
Lee Sharpe was supposed to be the future of English football. At 17, he signed for Manchester United, and within 2 years, he was destroying fullbacks across the First Division with a swagger that made grown men look foolish. He won 3 Premier League titles, an FA Cup and a League Cup. He danced in the corner flag at Highbury after a hat-trick in the League Cup. He was electric, magnetic, and absolutely terrifying to defend against on his best days. I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. But here's what nobody really talks about. Behind all of that, Sharpe carried a burning resentment towards certain people in and around his world. Some were teammates, one was his own manager, and the friction between Sharpe and these 7 men tells you everything about why a player with that much raw talent ended up drifting through Leeds, Sampdoria, and Exeter before disappearing entirely. This is the story of the 7 footballers Lee Sharpe secretly hated, and why every single one of those grudges says more about Sharpe than it does about them. When Roy Keane arrived from Nottingham Forest in 1993, Lee Sharpe was already a known face at Old Trafford. He'd been there since 1988. He knew the city, knew the club, knew which doors to knock on after midnight. So, naturally, he took the young Irishman under his wing. Sharpe took Keane out, showed him around, introduced him to Manchester's nightlife. On the surface, it looked like a genuine friendship between 2 lads who were similar in age and similar in energy. But walking alongside Roy Keane was like walking on broken glass in bare feet. You never quite knew when something was going to cut you. Keane had a ferocious intensity that didn't switch off when he left the training ground. He'd berate teammates over their clothes, over the car they drove, over the kind of music they played. He picked bar fights not because he was looking for trouble, but because he wanted to see if the men around him would back him up. It was a loyalty test, disguised as aggression, and not everyone passed. Sharpe has talked openly about these nights out, describing Keane as a nasty drunk at times, aggressive and difficult to manage once alcohol was involved. He recounts putting Keane in cabs, steering him away from situations that could have ended badly, essentially acting as an unofficial minder for a man who was already becoming one of the most feared players in European football. Sharpe frames these stories with a kind of fond exasperation, like a man describing a difficult pet he once owned. But strip away the humour, and what you're actually hearing is a man who was intimidated by Keane's standards. Because Keane's aggression off the pitch was an extension of his demands on it. He didn't separate the two. He wanted the men around him to be warriors in every setting, and Sharpe, for all his gifts, was not built that way. Sharpe was built for joy. He wanted goals and music and laughter. Keane wanted blood. The tension between them never boiled over into an open falling out, which almost makes it worse. Sharpe even admits that Keane never had a fallout with him the way he did with almost every other footballer in his circle. But the dynamic was clear. Keane respected Sharpe just enough to keep the peace, and Sharpe resented Keane just enough to keep talking about him decades later. That's not friendship. That's 2 men who never quite understood each other and never really tried to. By the time Sharpe moved to Leeds United in 1996, his best days were already behind him. The injuries had started piling up, the relationship with Ferguson had curdled, and he arrived at Elland Road carrying the ghost of who he used to be, desperately hoping a fresh start would bring back the player who'd once lit up Old Trafford. Then he looked across at what the media was doing with David Ginola, and the resentment hit him like a cold wind. Ginola was everything British football worshipped from a distance, but rarely produced itself. Long hair, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, a first touch so smooth it looked rehearsed. He floated across pitches while the crowd gasped. He posed on the touchline between moments of brilliance, and the cameras loved every second of it. And Sharpe, watching from the sidelines in Leeds colours, couldn't stand it. Because in Sharpe's world, British wingers were expected to graft. You tracked back, you took hits, you covered your fullback, you defended from the front. You didn't glide around collecting applause while the man behind you was being pulled apart by a striker you failed to close down. Sharpe believed Ginola collected the glory without doing the dirty work, and that the press gave him a free pass simply because he was French and beautiful and spoke in a way that made journalists forget to ask hard questions. There's a real class tension buried inside that grievance. Sharpe came up through the ranks at Torquay United before Ferguson spotted him. He grafted, he earned it. Ginola arrived wrapped in a mythology that had been built in France and imported wholesale into English football without scrutiny. Sharpe resented the worship. He resented the double standard, and deep down, he probably resented the fact that Ginola's flair was celebrated while his own, back in his prime, had always come with conditions attached. Before Ginola, before Leeds, before any of the chaos that followed, there was Jesper Olsen, and this one is different. This wasn't a rival from another club, and it wasn't a teammate Sharpe clashed with over football. This was something more personal, more insidious, and in many ways, more damaging. Olsen was a Danish winger who played for United between 1984 and 1988, and he was still at the club when Sharpe arrived as a teenager. He was a decent player, quick and clever, but what Sharpe couldn't stomach had nothing to do with his football. It was what Olsen allegedly did off the pitch that left a sour taste that Sharpe never quite got rid of. The accusation, quietly but consistently attached to Olsen in the United dressing room, was that he was a teacher's pet in the most damaging sense of the phrase. Players suspected him of carrying tales back to Ferguson, not in a way that was ever proven, not in a way that anyone could pin directly on him, but the kind of suspicion that spreads through a dressing room like damp through plaster. One player mentions it, another nods, and suddenly the feeling is everywhere, and nobody quite trusts the man in the corner. For a young Sharpe, he was already learning that his lifestyle sat uncomfortably close to the edge of what Ferguson would tolerate. The idea of a teammate feeding information upward, genuinely terrifying. The drinking, late nights, the parties that crept past curfew, all of it was already precarious. Sharpe was one phone call away from being sent back to digs at any moment, and he knew it. Ferguson had already proved he had eyes everywhere. So Olsen became a symbol of something Sharpe hated about the culture at the club during those early years. The idea that the walls had ears, that loyalty among players wasn't guaranteed. Someone in your own dressing room might be quietly dismantling you with a word in the right ear. Whether Olsen was actually guilty of any of it is another question entirely, but in Sharpe's mind, the suspicion was enough. And in football, suspicion has the same weight as fact. The irony is that Olsen left United in 1988, the same year Sharpe arrived. They barely overlapped, but the culture of paranoia Olsen supposedly represented, that stayed with Sharpe for years. If the Olsen situation was about quiet resentment, what Mick Harford did to Lee Sharpe was the opposite of quiet. Harford was a Luton Town striker built along lines that had nothing to do with elegance. He was big, physical, and utterly indifferent to whether you enjoyed being in his company. He played football like a man clearing a building site, and when a young Sharpe came up against him, Harford made sure the experience was unforgettable in the worst possible way. During one match, Harford leaned close to Sharpe and told him, calmly, without anger, which made it worse, that if he tried any more of his fancy step-overs, he'd break his legs. Then he went back to doing exactly that throughout the game, hunting Sharpe across the pitch with the kind of focused menace that can only come from a man who genuinely enjoys inflicting discomfort. This wasn't frustration in the heat of the moment, it was calculated, it was premeditated. Harford had decided before kickoff that Sharpe needed to be scared, and he was very good at his job. Sharpe despised him for it, and you can understand why. Everything Sharpe had was built on movement, on confidence, on the belief that if he ran at you with the ball, you'd come off second. Harford was trying to take that belief away, not with better defending, but with the threat of physical destruction. That's not football. That's intimidation, dressed up in football kit. What makes this grudge so telling is that Harford represents a type Sharpe ran into repeatedly throughout his career. The enforcer, whose entire role was to make life miserable for players like him. Pacey, skillful wingers were always going to be targets for that kind of treatment in the English game during the late 1980s and 1990s. The pitches were heavy, the referees were lenient, and certain defenders wore your discomfort like a badge of honour. Sharpe never forgot it. And honestly, with a threat like that hanging in the air on a cold Tuesday night at Kenilworth Road, who would? There's a particular kind of threat that doesn't come from the opposition. It comes from inside the building, from someone who wears the same training kit, eats in the same canteen, and is quietly being groomed to take everything you have. Keith Gillespie was that threat for Lee Sharpe. Gillespie came through the United youth system with a kind of raw pace that made coaches forget everything else. He was direct, aggressive with the ball, and frighteningly hard to contain once he got his head up and started running. Ferguson saw enough in him to keep him around the first team, and everyone in that dressing room understood what that meant. When a manager starts developing your direct replacement, he doesn't always tell you. He just lets the training sessions do the talking. Sharpe and Gillespie barely spoke, not because there was one explosive confrontation, no single moment that cracked the relationship beyond repair. It was colder than that. They existed in parallel, two wingers circling the same position, sharing a corridor, but occupying entirely different emotional universes. Sharpe was the established name trying to hold his ground, while injuries and Ferguson's impatience steadily eroded his standing. Gillespie was the coming tide. The rivalry had a quiet, grinding quality to it, made the daily reality of training miserable. Every time Gillespie did something well in a session, it was another brick removed from the wall Sharpe was trying to hold up. And Sharpe knew it. He wasn't naive about how football worked. He'd watched Ferguson discard players before, watched men who'd given years to the club get quietly shuffled out when something shinier came along. When Gillespie eventually left for Newcastle in January 1995, part of the deal that brought Andy Cole to Old Trafford, Sharpe didn't exactly grieve the departure. But the damage was already done. The competition had worn him down, added another layer of anxiety to a situation that was already fragile. Sharpe left for Leeds just 18 months after Gillespie went to Newcastle. The two men never really repaired whatever thin thread of professional respect had existed between them. Some rivalries don't end, they just stop having an arena. Roy Keane came at you with noise. Mick Harford came at you with threats. Mark Hughes had a different method entirely, and in some ways, it cut deeper than either of those approaches. Hughes simply looked through Lee Sharpe like he wasn't there. The striker was old school in the most literal sense. He believed football was earned through suffering, through collisions and hard yards, and the willingness to put your body between the ball and a centre-back who had no interest in your well-being. He'd done it his entire career. He'd been kicked all over Europe and come back for more. He wore the bruises like a curriculum vitae. Then he looked across the dressing room and saw Sharpe, the loud music, the clothes that belonged on a video shoot rather than a training pitch, the general sense that Sharpe moved through the world as if the difficult parts were optional, and Hughes decided, without ever making a formal announcement, that he didn't have much time for any of it. The silent treatment is a precise weapon in a football dressing room because it operates without any evidence. Hughes never shouted at Sharpe, never publicly called him out, never gave him a confrontation he could respond to or argue against. He simply withdrew warmth and left Sharpe to interpret the absence however he wanted. Sharpe interpreted it as contempt, and given what we know about Hughes's values, he was probably right. What made it genuinely damaging was the double standard it created in Sharpe's mind. Ferguson was riding him constantly about his lifestyle. Keane was setting impossible standards of intensity. And now Hughes, a man revered in that dressing room, was making clear through silence alone that Sharpe didn't quite belong in the same category of seriousness. For a young player whose confidence was already being squeezed from multiple directions, that kind of social exclusion compounds everything else. Sharpe never accused Hughes of cruelty. There was nothing specific enough to point at. The joylessness Hughes brought to their shared space, the quiet refusal to meet Sharpe where he was, chipped away at something the winger needed more than most, the feeling that he was genuinely wanted by the people around him. Every name on this list sits somewhere in the background. Ferguson sits at the centre of all of it. He was the gravitational force around which Sharpe's entire career orbited, and the relationship between them was never simple. Ferguson spotted Sharpe at Torquay when the boy was barely old enough to drive. He brought him to Old Trafford, gave him a shirt, gave him a stage. In many ways, he made Lee Sharpe. And then, methodically and without apparent sentiment, he unmade him too. The house party is the story everyone knows. Ferguson received a tip-off, and Sharpe only found out years later that the call came from Ryan Giggs's own mother. The two young wingers were hosting a gathering that had no business appearing in a professional footballer's diary. Ferguson drove over himself. He knocked on the door, walked in, and cleared the room. Then he stood in front of Sharpe and Giggs and tore into them with the kind of fury that doesn't leave the room when the shouting stops. It follows you to training, to your sleep, to every moment you spend on the pitch, trying to prove something. But that night wasn't the peak of the conflict. It was a symptom of something that had been building for years. Ferguson controlled every dimension of Sharpe's life at United, decided where Sharpe lived, when he could move in with his girlfriend, whether his personal choices were compatible with the standards of the club. He sent the girlfriend back to Birmingham after a bad performance at Anfield. He threatened digs. He used the full weight of his authority, not just to manage a footballer, but to govern a person. Sharpe dealt with it by avoidance. He heard Ferguson's footsteps in the corridor and turned the other way. He stayed out of sight, stayed quiet, tried to shrink himself small enough to avoid the next confrontation. That's not how you survive under the greatest manager in the country's history. That's how you slowly disappear. By 1996, Ferguson had seen enough. Sharpe was sold to Leeds for £1.5 million, a fraction of what his talent had once suggested he was worth. Ferguson moved on without looking back. He always did.